chapter 2 and verse 4 says this: He who sits in the heavens laughs. You ever stop and ask the question? I don't know if you ever have, but what is it that makes God laugh? Years ago, when our kids were littler, I guess I would say, our son Calvin was maybe in, I don't know, he was maybe in 5th or 6th grade, and I had a passion for basketball, and so the boys had a passion for basketball. Sunday afternoons, we would go down into the parking lot of the church, and we were living in the parsonage right next door, and we would go down and we would play one-on-one, or we would shoot baskets or whatever, and my coaching brain would kick in, and we would play for hours, and we just loved it. And one particular Sunday afternoon, my older son, I don't know what he was doing, but it was just my second son and I, and we went down to the parking lot and we started playing basketball. And after we were down there for a little bit, a fellow showed up, one of the guys that he had attended the church kind of on and off over the years. And his daughter was a couple of years older than my son. His name was Gordon. And so he gets out of the car and he's got on his short shorts and his headband and his tank top, and his daughter is there, and they're, come on, can we play? Sure, let's just shoot around. And so we're shooting for a little bit, and then pretty soon he starts challenging my son and I to a basketball game. I'm like, this isn't going to end well. But we conceded. We said, okay. And so we agreed we were going to play to 10, and it was going to be, if you make it, you get the ball back and you can go again. And so we started out, and I think they scored a basket, and we got the ball from them, and we scored a basket. And then I'm watching this, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what, this is too easy. And so I didn't play hard. I didn't try hard, and I'd throw the ball off the backboard, and I'd let them get it, and they would score. And pretty soon it was 4-1. And then it was 5-1, and my son can see what I'm doing, and he is so he's just so competitive. And he's looking at me like, Dad, what is the matter with you? And he would go like this, and he'd just give me the stare down, like, come on, Dad, let's go. And so it was 6-1, 7-1, 8-1, 9-1, and as it was getting against us in the score, all of a sudden Gordon thought it was time to start trash talking. And so his daughter's just kind of playing along, but he is just ripping on us like, oh, come on, guys, man, look at this score. We're up on you. And I finally look at my son, and I smile, and I wink. And we beat him 10-9. And on the inside, I'm laughing the whole time thinking, we've played basketball together so much. And we had all these little things that we could do just with a nod or a wink, or I would give him a thumbs up, or I would give him that look, and he would know exactly what I wanted him to do, and away he would go, and we'd do the give and go or the back door or whatever it was, and it's just layup after layup after layup, and all of a sudden the game is over. Well, Gordon didn't come back to church for a while, needless to say. And I felt kind of bad about it, but in the moment, I was laughing. Because I knew what my son's potential was. I wasn't the greatest basketball player in the world, but I was watching this, and it's just like, this is just, here we go. And so God sits in heaven, and he looks down upon his creation. And as he's looking down upon his creation, he's thinking, you have got to be kidding me. You really think you can do that and get away with it, and I'm not going to notice? And he laughs because he knows who's in control. He knows who's in charge. And he ultimately knows what the final score is going to be and who is going to come out as the winner. Now, I want to look at this psalm in Psalm chapter 2, and it's very intriguing as you begin to draw into it. A little bit of background, from the Psalms, if you have your notes there, from the Psalms, there's a lot of things that we can learn, and we've got to take some time just to kind of dig in there and be good observers and then good understanders of what the Scriptures are teaching. Because the Psalms will declare before us the character and the power of God in so many ways. Over and over and over again, you see that. We can see the character and the power of God in creation. We can see it in His justice. We see it in His redemption. We see it in the compassion that He displays toward us. We can also learn an awful lot about the character of man. And we learn about the emotions of man. I can remember years ago I was going through just an awful time of depression. Just up against some horrendous challenges in ministry. I was chairing the school board at the Christian school, and we were in the middle of a building program, and I was pastoring a church, and just a lot of things were going on, and I was just feeling so beat up and so discouraged and so depressed in all of this. And a very good friend of mine came to me, and he told me, he said, I'm going to give you a homework assignment. He said, I want you to take the book of Psalms, and I want you to divide it up so that you're reading 5 Psalms a day. And he said it works pretty conveniently. There's 150 chapters. There's 30 days in the month. Okay? So he said on day 1, you read chapter 1. You read 31, 61, 91, 121. Day 2, you move to the next one. He said if there's 31 days in the month, then you save Psalm 119 for that. Otherwise, that's a forever psalm. You just keep going and going and going because it is so long. And he said, and as you do that, highlight every emotion of man that you see, of the writer, of what David was going through, what the other writers are going through. And as you highlight those emotions and what they're struggling with, see if they have a solution to their struggle. And so many of the Psalms, they'll begin with a word of praise, and then they'll take you through this tremendous struggle, and then they'll bring you to a conclusion that brings you hope. And I started doing that, and I did that for several months, and it really helped to kind of draw me out of that discouragement and that depression, because there was so much here of great value in that. Now, the book of Psalms in the Hebrew, it comes from a title that means the book of praises. And so when the Old Testament was first translated, the first translation of the Old Testament into another language was into the Greek, into a version known as the Septuagint. And when it was translated over into the Septuagint, the term psalmos was given and was used for a title. And this means it's a song that is to be sung to the accompaniment of a stringed instrument. Okay? And that's just a very simple title for that. And then in the 1600s, good old King Jimmy said, we're going to make an English Bible. And the King James Bible was translated then from the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic into the English language. And the title Psalms was given to it. It was taken actually from are you interested in the history side of this? From the Septuagint, and so that was what was given to it, and that is what is held up in all of our English translations even unto today. Now, the primary author in the Psalms was David, but you may be surprised to know that David only wrote about half of them. I think 73 are definitely identified as Davidic Psalms. There are others that they're not quite sure about that he may have been the human author to, but there were also many other authors in the Psalms. A fellow by the name of Korah had some sons who were writers, and they wrote at least 11 of the Psalms. Asaph wrote 12 of the Psalms. Solomon wrote a couple of them. Somebody by the name of Ethan wrote a psalm. I have no idea who Ethan is. And Moses is actually credited with at least one of the Psalms. But what it is it is basically a songbook that is put together of all of these incredible writings, and it is compiled as a book of worship for us. The Psalms are primarily Hebrew poetry. Now, in our English prose, we always have to make sure it rhymes. So roses are red, violets are blue, and then you got to have something that rhymes with you. Come on, give me a little bit of credit for my poetry here. But in Hebrew poetry, it is not written in that way. Okay, they're not rhymes, but they are thought lines. And so the Proverbs is actually a form of poetry. And the Psalms is just a series of thought lines to draw you through the process of understanding. Now, the primary focus of the Psalms is God's relationship with His creation. And He relates with us as individuals, but He also relates as nations and even with the nation of Israel. One of the things you find as you go through the Psalms, and even in the example that we're going to look at this morning, is many of the Psalms are messianic. You know what I mean by the term messianic? They are prophetically pointing to the anointed one to come, who is Christ. Now, this was written approximately 1,000 years before the time of Christ and 3,000 years prior to now. But many times as you are reading through the Psalms, you cannot help but see Christ everywhere in the Psalms. Psalm 1 begins as a book of blessing. Okay? Blessed is the man. Psalm 2 ends with a blessing. Blessed are all who take refuge in Him. Psalm 1 is basically a beginning point, obviously, being the first one, but it sets the tone for all of the Psalms. And it talks about, blessed is the man who does not walk or sit or, how does it go? Walk, stand, or sit in the presence of evil. But he is found in his pursuit of God. But now you come down to Psalm chapter 2. And it's pointing to the Messiah. And as we look at this, it's broken into 4 divisions. And this is what you'll see in your notes. I have it there in 4 divisions. But if you look at it as it begins, the question is asked, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And so the first division of the psalm is the first 3 verses. Then it talks about the rebellion of the kings. The kings rebel against God. And it is though the kings are looking at God and they're saying, who are you to tell us what to do? If you followed the news in the last 48 hours, you saw the captivity of Maduro in Venezuela. And I never know what to believe on the internet and what not to believe, but I saw a caption on the internet where he is saying, come and get me. If you think you can find me, come and get me. This is where I'll be. And it's like he was laughing at the possibility that anybody could get to him. And he was just raging against the powers that be. And this is what the psalmist is writing about here, not Maduro, but he's writing about the nations looking up at God, shaking their fist and saying, who do you think you are that you can tell us what to do? Now, it's easy to see that at a national level. But there's not one of us here that hasn't done that in our own personal, individual lives. Maybe not openly, vocally, shaking our fist at the heavens. But we tend to do what we do because we want what we want. And as we get to that point of life, we are making decisions that are basically in the face of God saying, who do you think you are telling me what to do? Telling me how to live. And so why do the nations rage? And the peoples plot in vain. The kings of the earth, they set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. Who is His anointed? Speaking of Christ. So already in the beginning of chapter 2, the opening verses of the psalm, you are introduced to the concept that there is an anointed one that is coming, and yet the nations rage and individuals, the peoples of the earth, are shaking their fist against the heavens and against the Lord, and they're saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. You know, it's almost like a dog on a leash. You know, and it's like he's not going to lead us around where we're going. We're going to cut the leash. We're going to run. We're going to do whatever we want to do, and God is not going to be there to tell us that it is not for us to do. And so he begins with this question: why would any nation think that they could stand against God? You know, he says it this way: why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? It's a rhetorical question. He's not pausing there and waiting for you to answer.
because you already know the answer. It's a question of astonishment. After all that God has done for us, after all that God has done for the nations, after all that God has done for Israel, after all that God has done for you, why would you think to rebel? We have chickens. Many of you know we have chickens. And we have an inner fence and an outer fence. We have the coop, an inner fence, and an outer fence. And so when they got their inner courtyard all scratched up and there was nothing but dirt there, we opened the fence, let them into the outer fence, which is much bigger. It goes out into a little bit of the woods, and they can go anywhere they want in there. They will tend to go down next to the dog pen and stand there and torment the dogs and get the dogs barking. But the other day, we came home, we drove in the driveway, and when we drive in, we naturally look, okay, where are the chickens at? What are they doing? And they weren't there. And I looked off, and they had all got through a hole in the fence, and they were headed to the woods. Okay? And I'm thinking to myself, you stupid chickens. Why do you put a fence up for chickens? Because there's harm. There are predators. There's protection that is needed. And so it wasn't real hard to open the gate, get around behind them, and get back in there. But you know, God has given us His law as a fence. It's a fence that has been put in place for our protection because there are predators. There are things that will destroy us if we allow them to. But what is our natural tendency? Every day we wake up and we go around and we search the perimeter. And we look for a tiny little break in the fence, anywhere that we can get out, because we want to be on the other side of the fence. That's the natural tendency of man. That's the natural tendency of chickens. So you're just a bunch of chickens. Okay? But it's that tendency of wanting to move beyond the boundary. And this is the question that is being asked here is, why would anyone want to move beyond the boundary? If God has put a boundary in place for our good, for our protection, He knows that on the other side of the boundary is where the fox and the mink and the coyotes and all of those creatures out there that could hurt and destroy are going to be. He says, stay within the boundaries. That's where I can protect you. That's where I can care for you. Go to verse 4. Look at God's response in this. He sees the rebellion, and in the rebellion they're saying, we're going to cut the leash, we're going to burst the bonds, we're going to cut the cords, we're going to get through the fence, we're going to go on a run. Verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. This is not a laugh of, boy, isn't that funny? It's not a humor laugh. But what makes God laugh is the realization that we would be so arrogant as to think that we can get through the fence, that we can make our run, that we can go and live in our own little empire and do whatever we want to do, and God will not notice. You know, it's easy for us to get concerned and troubled about how the leaders in our world respond to Christianity. How the name of Christ is becoming a forbidden language. How the Word of God is forbidden in public forums so many times in so many places. You know, we get troubled, we get frustrated, we get angered. How does God react? He sits in heaven and laughs. Shakes his head and he says, silly people. Silly people. You think you can run up the score on me and I'm not going to win? Silly people. And it's not just that we're breaking out of the boundaries and running up the score or whatever analogy you want to use, but we're very arrogant about it. Really, God? You think you can control this one? And we find ourselves going and doing those things that are just in the face of God. And so he laughs. It's not as though there's humor in the situation, but because of the foolishness of those that think they can erase his existence and his influence. How did Nebuchadnezzar do with that one? What about the Pharaoh? Let my people go, not on your life. And yet his armies are buried at the bottom of the Red Sea. God snickered at their attempts, and then he greatly humbled them. So you got to remember, this psalm is not merely pointing to the rebellion of the nations in David's time. It's prophetic. It's pointing to the cross. It's pointing to the anointed one. It's pointing to a time that's even yet future from now, when the nations will conspire under the Antichrist to overthrow Jehovah and his anointed son. In our present age, God is inviting us by his grace. But in the future, he's going to judge by his wrath. Notice again. He says, he who sits in the heavens, in verse 4, he laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, and he will terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Who's the king? It's the Lord Jesus. He said, go ahead, run up the score. I'm putting my king on the throne in Zion. And the scales are going to balance out eventually. You're not going to get away with this continually. And so he responds in this way. The king is Jesus, and he will come to judge, and he will come to rule, and he will come to reign. Okay, go to verse 7. You get to the third division in this passage. And in this division, you find that it is Christ that rules. He says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. In this portion, we are assured that even though the nations may rebel, God will have the last word. You ever get to the point in your life where you've been hurt, where you've been just beat up by somebody that shouldn't be doing those kinds of things to you, and you just look around and you say, Lord, just get some justice here. Just deal with this. I just want to see justice. I want to see a resolution to this that I can see with my own eyes. So I'm tired of it. Tired of being beat up. Tired of being hurt. You know, and in this portion, we're being assured that even though the nations rebel, God's going to have the last word. And you know, even though we may find ourselves in situations, circumstances of life where we're being beat up, where we're being slandered, where we're being hurt, we've got to resolve, you know what? I'm not the one on the throne. God is on the throne. And he is the one that's able to balance the scales and bring all things to justice. He promised that his son, Christ, the one who is anointed, will be given the authority to rule and to reign over all the nations of the earth. And this will be fulfilled when he comes at the second coming and establishes his kingdom on the earth for 1,000 years. He talks about that in Revelation. But when he comes, he will be given the nations as an inheritance. And if you notice the terminology here, he says, the Lord said to me, you are my son. Verse 7, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. Now notice the imagery that he gives here. He says, you shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now as I was looking at that, I'm like, what in the world is he talking about? Where's he going with this? In ancient days, when a king was about to take his army and go to war, he would bring his leaders into the room, and he would begin to lay out the strategy for them. And somewhere deep in tradition, one of the things that a ruler would typically do is he would get these clay jars, these big clay pots that would be sitting there, and he would take a rod of iron and he would say, our enemy is as that pot, and he would smash that pot with the rod of iron and show his leaders his determination to conquer and to control, to show the world who is king and who is boss and who is victor in the battle. And so you have this imagery that is being used here. And from what I understand, it is as though God is saying, you know what? You're the clay pot. This nation is the clay pot. People of the earth are the clay pot. And there's going to come a day where if they rebel, I'm going to sit and snicker and laugh and say, who do they think they are? And this is what I'll do to them. I will bring ultimate justice to them. The psalmist uses this ancient custom to describe Christ's coming in victory. No nation will endure the fierceness of his judgment. Now, you go through all of that, and you're like, okay, I agree. I hope you agree that God is still on the throne. Behold our God. He is seated on the throne. He is the one who rules and reigns forever and ever and ever. What about us? How do we respond to this? Now, the Psalms will take you on a journey if you stop and you really dig into what's going on there. And the journey begins with the rebellion of the nations. And then it leads us to this understanding of God's response and then the rule of Christ. You know, the very same thing takes place in our life. We are born into rebellion. The natural tendency with our sinful, rebellious heart is to say to God, who do you think you are? And then he reminds us. He laughs and he says, you have no idea. But I'm on the throne and my Son is coming to rule and to reign. But what's our responsibility in this? Follow a bit further. I love the transition in verse 10. Now therefore. Okay, therefore. That's a great word. It brings us to an understanding that there's a conclusion on its way. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Okay, let's break this down in our own lives. We talked before about who is on the throne of your life. You think you're the king of your life? Be wise. This can be an individual application as it can be a national application. But he says, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So what is man's responsibility in the midst of this? In light of these things, what should we do? This is where the application comes. This is where we need to sit up and pay attention and say, okay, Lord, in my life, what are those areas that I've been struggling with, that I've been rebelling with? Okay, starting a new year, let's deal with them. Then deal with them again tomorrow. And when you get to June and July and August, don't stop dealing with them. But what are those areas of my life? What are those sins that have captured me, that have so easily beset me? And what do I do with all of this? How do I respond to this? Then he begins with the challenge of learn and be wise. Learn and be wise. If you look there in verse 10, he says, be warned, O rulers of the earth. So learn and be wise. Be instructed. Be teachable. The second thing he tells us is submit and serve. He says, if you follow down further, he says, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Renew a reverent heart, a reverent fear for God. Recognize who he is. Recognize that he is on the throne. Humble yourselves before him and serve him. And as you do, the product of that is it's going to produce rejoicing in your life. As long as you continually rebel, he has a way of making you miserable. And a lot of that misery comes from ourselves. But when we are willing to submit to Him, to humble ourselves before Him, to serve Him in the fear of the Lord, then the joy begins to return to our lives. The interesting phrase he uses here next, he says, kiss the Son. And it's not S-U-N, that burn your lips, okay? It's S-O-N. Kiss the Son. Again, if you go back to the ancient world, a evidence of submission to a ruler would be to bow before him and kiss his signet ring. And there's an imagery here of submission, but it's also an imagery of worship where you are bowing before the king and you're surrendering your life to him in devotion and worship before him. An act of submissive, reverent adoration, taking the opportunity to be repentant and reconciled before him. And so he's inviting us to come before him and recognize who he is and devote ourselves to worshiping him and serving him and adoring him. He says, kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. We need to understand that God is in control. And it's either going to be a reverent adoration and worship, or it's going to be a rebellious response by man. And if we rebel, there are consequences because it kindles the anger of God. But the final thing I want you to see here is he ends the psalm with blessed are all who take refuge in him. And so the final thing is trust and be blessed. So many people view submission to God as a very oppressive and a negative thing. Like a fence for the chickens. And it's like, I just got to get on. If I could just get to the other side of the fence, then I would know freedom and joy forevermore. They get to the other side of the fence only to meet the predator that's there waiting to destroy them. This is the present view of our nation, of many nations, of rebellion. Just all of the attempts to remove God and the evidence of God from our culture and from our world. But as believers who profess Christ, may it never be. Even though daily we're drawn and we're tempted just to push him back, to rebel against him. That's the nature, that old nature that still dwells within us. But instead we need to fall before him, to kiss the Son, to adore him, to worship him, to surrender to him, to serve him. And so as we go into the new week, into the new year, take the time to evaluate. What is that place? What is that part? What is that area of my life that I'm holding back? What's that hole in my fence that I've just got to keep crawling through that I know is going to lead to destruction? God's the one that's keeping score, and he knows what the final score is going to be. And we may feel like we're winning, but pretty soon he's going to laugh. He's going to nod. And he's going to bring things to justice. And that justice comes either by our surrender or by his wrath. That's pretty hard. But that's where the truth is. And so we've got to surrender and submit to that and grow in that relationship. There's a word for all of this. It's the word abide. If you abide in me and my word abides in you, you bear much fruit. Father, teach us to hold the King in esteem. Teach us to be honest with God and honest with ourselves. Teach us to be patient. Teach us to be patient with others. to be patient in our growth, that we're not frustrated, but that we're trusting you as we walk from day to day. And help us to be fully devoted, abiding in you above and beyond all other things. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand.